ground rules, so I think we can bring everyone in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Kennan Institute. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm Deputy Director here at the Institute, and just a few announcements before we get started on upcoming events. First, this coming Monday, on May 23rd, we will have a talk on Belarus in transition with Professor Laura Stitarenko and our own Valery Yevorutsky, who is a Fulbright Research Scholar in residence at the Kennan Institute. And then on Thursday, May 26th, from 10 to 11:30, we will have a film screening of A Struggle for Home, the Crimean Tatars, which is produced by Christina Pashin and Insa Bauman. And we'll have Kathy Cosman as our commentator for that event. So we look forward to seeing you at those events. Today, we're in for a treat. We are here to talk about something that I'm sure most of us have intimate knowledge of, that being the Moscow Metro. We are so pleased to have Professor James Andrews, who is Professor of Modern Russian and Comparative Eurasian History at Iowa State University, where he also recently has been the director of the University Center in the Arts and Humanities. Jim has many distinctions. I will only note one, that he is a former Title VIII Fellow here, and he was in residence here a couple of years ago, and we enjoyed having him while he was here. He's also been affiliated since 1995 as a senior scholar at the Russian Academy of Sciences in both Moscow and St. Petersburg. He is currently completing a textbook entitled Science and the Public Sphere, European and Eurasian Culture, 1543 to the Present, which we anticipate to be out in 2017. But to keep himself busy, he also has his new project on the Moscow Metro, and that's what he's going to be talking today. So Jim, great pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody coming out on this rainy day, and I thank all of the Kennan staff. I remember being here fondly. They were so helpful. And I really thank my friend and colleague who I've known for 30 years, Will Pomeranz, back since the Gorbachev days.
Exactly.
I'd like to, before I get to the heart of today's talk, and I promise I'll be very succinct, I just wanted to say a couple words about how I came to this project, and then a little bit on the pre-1932 era. I mean, the Metro was started in 1932, but what's little known is that they debated about having a metro in Moscow well before the revolution, much like other European cities. And the Bolsheviks documented everything, but they photographically documented the beginnings before the late 30s as well. And then I'm going to talk mostly about visual iconography and some of the architects that were involved in the project, and I thought that would be a good theme, you know, for a public talk, instead of getting into the engineering and various other aspects that I cover. Can everyone hear me pretty well back there? So, you know, originally I had just back in 2012 finished two books, Red Cosmos and Into the Cosmos, on the history of Russian and Soviet spaceflight. And so I guess I've been living in a Khrushchevian world since then, right, because Khrushchev was so much involved in the building of the metro, as well as Kaganovich. But the reason I bring that up is I've been interested as a historian of science and technology, and as of late, in iconic technologies, right? And obviously the space program was the most iconic, and as was the metro. And I think that's what led me to this study, if there was any kind of a link. But for me, the metro is also a complex prism to understand mobility, mass transportation. I'm very interested in public space, narrative, and iconography, although I'm not an urban specialist, nor am I an art historian. I'm a historian of science and technology and popular culture. And so that's how I came to the project. And originally I thought of it as a Stalin-era project, 1932 to 53. But then as I did more research in the pre-revolutionary archives, I'm going to break the book into three periods, 1902 to 31, sort of the background, the period from 1932 to 53, and then 53 to the present, because there's some interesting development in the history of the metro in the Khrushchev period and beyond that I'm going to talk about as well. Briefly, the first plan to build a Moscow subway or a metro was actually proposed to the Moscow City Council or what was called Duma, in the summer of 1902. So pretty early, by two engineers. Their names were Peter Belinsky and Evgeny Gnor. And the project was basically rejected by the Duma because of the excessive cost. They estimated anywhere between 1 to 2 million rubles for the time. And the city did not have that kind of financial backing. But they rejected it also for the potential, what they call the potential dislocation it would cause in the city center during construction. And if you look at any European metros during this time, as I have, maybe the French metro, which was earlier, started in the late 19th century, the Berlin metro, most of them were built just below the ground, right? They weren't what are called deep shaft building like the Moscow metro was, or some of the London metro after the 30s, like Piccadilly Circus, for those of you who've been in stations like that in London. And so the reason why I bring this up too is besides the excessive costs of the project, this would be a big dislocation to the city. And you saw merchants, conservative public opinion was against it originally, this became quite a problem and a debate. And so I've been looking at these debates. I've become more interested in them as a background to the Soviet era. The debates arose again, if you're interested quickly, in 1912, 2 years before the war. They were kind of complex, but again, the Moscow Duma's executive board said that the building of the metro was way beyond its means. They even started to negotiate with private companies before the revolution, and they looked at what were called concessions between 1913 and 14, but none of that came to naught. And really, Moscow as a city, if you look at its finances prior to the revolution of 1917, a lot of the way it generated finances were through what were called tramvai or trams, natural gas, too, taxes. I think that amounted by 1914 to about 60% of its revenue. And so it was just not ready to build that kind of a project at that time. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because then war, revolution, civil war occurred, and as many of you know who studied Russian history, between about 1918 to 21, Moscow even experienced what's called outmigration, right? Where people left the city and went out into the countryside. And so the population of the city actually by the early 20s decreased, and then it started regenerating itself. And so one of the things I've tried to argue is that by the late 1920s and early 30s, and this should be obvious, but with the beginning of Stalin's hyper-industrialization programs, number one. Number two, collectivization of the farmland. The city was literally flooded with new arrivals and migrants from rural areas. And this is what we call, the push factor or the push-pull factor, particularly the push factor out of the rural areas and into the cities. One local newspaper and what some contemporaries called Moscow was growing into what I would call ubiquitously a peasant metropolis. I mean, people were literally rushing in, and the population of the city had almost doubled in comparison to the two preceding decades. So there was enormous pressure, right, population pressure. And as I looked through Communist Party records, particularly local bureaucratic records, there was a lot of pressure during this time on bureaucrats to do something about this situation, particularly for mass transit and getting people around the city. And so by the 1930s, the need for better transportation was of utmost importance to the Soviet regime. And to accommodate the demands of this type of rapid in-migration, two prominent young communist figures, Nikita Khrushchev and Lazar Kaganovich, were entrusted with organizing the building of the first metro that, in my opinion, served two purposes, right? One is the practical, and that is the streets were overcrowded, moved the new urban masses underground. But the other, which I'm going to talk about more today, is the symbolic. And that is, the metro could serve as a visual and architectural showcase for socialism and a technological museum for the achievements of this workers, peasant, and Soviet state. So I'd like to think of the metro in these terms as well. And on another level, what I also want to talk to you about today is looking at sort of the 30s, then the post-World War II era, the late 40s, the Khrushchev-Brezhnev era, and then the Gorbachev and post-Soviet era as distinct eras. I mean, we seem to think of, or at least I did when I first started the project, we think of the metro as, the iconic, again, without being redundant, Stalin era tribute to the revolution. But what I want to introduce today is to think about the metro as evolving over time, and not just the story of Stalinism, but the story of socialism itself, and maybe the story of post-Soviet society. And so what I want to show you is how the metro could visually document the building of socialism under Stalin, catalog maybe its changing utilitarian nature under Khrushchev, and almost a kind of what I would describe as an architectural nothingness, utility being the emphasis in de-Stalinization, and maybe a sort of a neo-nationalist meaning today, although I don't want to be too reductive. I mean, it's more complex under Putin. And so I'll take you, in a way, on that journey in terms of a narrative. But before we get there, I just want to talk briefly about the period 1932 to about 36, 37. And I've been working with besides working in a number of major archives in Moscow, I've been working with a number of photographic archivists in the Museum of the History of Moscow, the Moscow Party or former Party Archive, which has a photographic archive, and the archive out at HIMKI, the National Photographic Archive. And they've allowed me to see negatives, and then I reproduce them, and they've made TIFFs. So much so that I'm thinking, and I was joking with Will and Blair Rubel, that I'm thinking of a coffee table book, called something like Bolshevik Selfies, right? How we documented ourselves and our capital. But seriously, on a serious note, I've become very interested in how the Moscow city and also Bolshevik central government documented these large projects. So the black and whites you'll see today are originals off original negatives. So again, so the Moscow Metro was proposed, and they started to think about the administrative financial element in 1932 very quickly. And what they did, what's interesting to me, is all throughout Moscow, they put up these billiards, as you could see here, right, that display, this is Akhotny Ryad, right, that displayed the plan. And it was almost like an advertisement, can you think of it in those terms, that the Metro, comrades, is coming. And they did this with other large-scale projects, but not to the same extent as they did with the Metro. And the first line was opened in May of 1935, and this is an original photograph that I thought you might want to see of Stalin here and Molotov here, right? And of course, you see many of these, sort of photographic photo ops of the major party leaders when it was first opening. And you see posters behind them like this one, there are no fortresses that the Bolsheviks can't storm, and you see a lot of this when the Metro was being built. What was interesting is this is the Kirovskaya station, the outer pavilion in 1935, and you could see the crowds lingering. And what I found interesting, again, to get back to this notion of like dealing with above ground crowding, I mean, I've looked through countless memoirs of 1930s Moscow party administrators, as well as archival letters, and they're constantly talking about how the subway hopefully will relieve congestion. One memoirist said, however, when people are hurrying to work in the morning, sturdy police officers line up near metro entrances like the one on Komsomolskaya Ploshchad, using their elbows to channel the crowds through the doors. At this time in the 1930s, this one administrator pointed out, and during the middle of the day and towards the late afternoon, even the new gigantic urban subway system cannot accommodate all the crowds in the new Metropolis. So you could hear, right, and feel, and I hope visually see the pressures that many were under. And even Khrushchev himself, in his memoirs, as well as some of his notes in his personal archive in Moscow, in his Lichny Fond, he too talked a lot about how he felt the transportation system in Moscow and some of the major cities, Leningrad and others, were, he called it hopelessly outdated and needed to be updated, particularly with mass rapid transit. And also, you could see that as part of Kaganovich, as some of you know, Lazar Kaganovich, one of Stalin's right-hand men and a major figure in the Moscow Party organization and leader, he also had sort of this grandiose general plan in Moscow that would above ground open up the boulevards. So for anyone of, say, my generation that first went to Russia at the end of the Brezhnev era, right? I mean, the first thing that we saw were these monstrous boulevards. And those boulevards were actually, some of them were created in the 30s. And you see, this is the Lenin Library metro station that was first opened up in May of 1935. And it's right, it was actually added to what was in the old 18th and 19th century what was called Pashkov House, which was an imperial palace that then turned into the Russian Library. And then after the 30s, this became the state library of Russia, or what was called the Leninka, and after 1991, the government state depository. Workers were brought in all over from the various parts of the Soviet Union. Some of them were given housing in the north, and they were given limited, what are called propiski, to live, and many of them actually just before the war had to leave. There were Komsomolskaya brigades, volunteer brigades. They also focused a lot on female brigades, as well as you could see here, although that was part of the propaganda, but it was true. Many women worked on the Moscow Metro, probably less so as administrators and not as architects, although in the 60s, as I'll show you, that's when very important female architects led building of metros during the Brezhnev era, metro stations, although you don't see that during Stalin's time. And of course, the regime was very interested in promoting that as well. And of course, any time a station opened, you'd see, dignitaries there cutting ribbons, et cetera. And I thought maybe you'd like to see some of these originals. And of course, Stalin always next to Lenin in the placards, which would change after 54 and also 1961. Okay, so with that said, what I'd like to do in whatever the 15, 20 minutes that I have is get us to think about sort of how images, architecture, and the types of people that worked on these projects changed over time. And I'd like to begin with the late 30s, first and foremost, and then move to the post-World War era. And we'll talk about specific architects as well. And then from there, get into the Khrushchev period and then the last period. And I'll take you on this whirlwind tour. And in a sense, from an academic perspective, when I'm thinking of urban art, architecture, and iconography, I like to quote the cultural theorist W.J.T. Mitchell, who likes to suggest that images, particularly ones of iconic projects, can evolve over time. That is, they could tell different stories at different times. They're not stagnant, right? They're not just telling the story of the revolution, which is what I'm trying to argue today with a project like the Metro. And they could almost develop time-specific, what I would call time-specific iconology. They could rhetorically speak to different generations of Soviets and then post-Soviets at different times, telling different stories about eras. And that, as I'll point out at the end, is I think, a generational thing as well. And so I want to begin by looking at what I call some of the earliest pre-World War II stations. They're generally considered, right, by most architectural historians to be the most interesting, the most successful stations. I'd like to think of them, this is the Kievsky metro station by the architect Chechulin, which was done in 1938. Some of you who've traveled to Russia might know that he was the architect that built the very controversial 1958 swimming pool on the site of the Palace of Soviets. that at least people from my generation swam in. And between 1945 and 49, he was the chief architect of Moscow. And he actually came from a very technical background. And also, I think also what comes from this kind of genre or period is my favorite, the station Mayakovskaya, right, which was built in September of 1938. Some of you may know that it was designed by Alexei Dushkin, and it won in 1938 the grand prize at the New York World's Fair for design. Its spacious, futuristic halls are adorned with stainless steel columns, colored marble, named after the futurist poet of the revolution, Vladimir Mayakovsky, who had a checkered, to some extent, relationship with the regime. Dushkin was also chief architect of Revolutionary Square Metro, and that's the one that has marble-lined arches and a series of statues by the sculptor Matvei Manazir. This is the one that may have the most typical Bolshevik narrative of the time. And if you look at it, and I apologize, this is the one slide that may not be as distinct as I would have liked, but the figures are really busts of Red Guards, workers, sailors, young communists, and pioneer heroes and heroines to the early Soviet era. And in my mind, they cast a particular historical narrative for the passenger when you're on the platform. It literally walks you in a linear progression through the history of the Bolshevik Revolution and its socialist or social constituencies. And it focuses on everyday heroes and heroines. I mean, it portrays them in a Promethean way, but it is a sort of a tribute to the revolution. If I think of these stations, I've just given you 3 examples. I mean, in a way, these architects had modernist tendencies. I mean, if you think of it, they used sleek marble. Some of them were trained in earlier times. What I find interesting about Dushkin is that he worked and was involved in city development and zoning planning in the Donbass, actually. And he may have been tapped by the young Kaganovich, who had headed the Ukrainian branch of the Communist Party at one point, as well as Khrushchev. I mean, both of them had spent a lot of time there. And they were interested in new modern city planning and modern-oriented architecture, yet, of course, involved in what I would call socialist realist thematics, so to speak. All right? And so that's kind of the early 30s, late 30s, after the first line was built. The metro, believe it or not, was still being built during the war. This is the Stalinskaya station that opened in 1944 during the war. It's one of those that bears the name of the great Vozhd, or leader, right? And after 1961, the second phase of de-Stalinization, it became Semenovskaya. I've been very interested, as I'll talk about in a second, and I'm going to try to be succinct, as Will would like me to, so that we can open it up to Q&A. But I've been very interested in what it was the process I call of erasure. And what I mean by that is Stalin's statues were in the metro. There were busts to Stalin. There were bas-reliefs, right? You could see here over the Stalinsky station. And obviously his name, the most famous one being Semenovskaya, and many of them were removed in what was the second phase of de-Stalinization under Khrushchev in the early 1960s, when they also did things like, remove Stalin's body from the mausoleum, et cetera. And so I'm trying to document this in some of the stations, both in terms of looking at orders that were created from above, and also the Moscow Party organization, but also doing it visually. And I like finding remnants, obviously, of the earlier ones. But if you look just quickly, right, the post-war stations that were built after maybe 1946 to 53, they took on a kind of a different thematic. They almost, you could argue, reflected martial themes, nationalism, architecture, without being reductive, was a little less modernist, a little more, I would call it a kind of Stalinist baroque almost, a little more ornate. The architectural space was laden with, almost overdone, laden with heroes of the past, not revolutionary figures, more grander, colossal, maybe even triumph of empire, you could argue, over the ethos of the older revolutionary emblems. This is what's called the second Komsomolskaya station, which was built in 1952 by the leading architect Alexei Khrushchev. And it has gold mosaics showing military parades and figures from Russian history by the artist Pavel Korin, which I'll show you in a second. I find Khrushchev a very interesting architect for the following reason. For those who know a little bit about the history of Russian art, Khrushchev actually studied under Leon Benoit and Ilya Repin, one of the pedevizhniki or wanderers in Russian art. So he comes from really training in the Imperial Academy of Arts, and here he is designing late Stalin era palaces, so to speak. I find that fascinating. Even thinking about this from a prosopographic perspective. He also did the building for Narkozem, the Ministeriate of Architecture. He was involved in the Lenin Mausoleum. When I looked at Khrushchev's memoirs, right, and there's a museum of architecture just near the Lenin Library that I've worked in extensively named after him, he argued that he stylized some of these stations, particularly this one, after 17th century Muscovite churches. This is what he thought. I mean, it's interesting to think about it from the architect's standpoint. And he worked with a man by the name of Pavel Korin, who studied at the Moscow School of Painting also before the revolution, right, in 1912. And he studied sculpture and architecture. And Korin, interestingly enough, was patronized by Maxim Gorky. And I've seen letters from people like Marshal Voroshilov and others that warned Gorky to stop patronizing some of these pre-revolutionary artists that were particularly interested in religious iconography and using religious iconography in a Soviet context, which is, to me, fascinating, right? Now, these are 1950s mosaics, and Korin was involved in the mosaics, if you're interested, and traveled to Moscow extensively. He did the Arbatskaya, he did Novoslobodskaya, and he did, of course, here, Komsomolskaya. And if you look here, on the left, you'll see a mosaic of the 13th century Veliki Knyaz, or Great Prince, Alexander Nevsky, right, who was a 13th century hero fighting against the Teutonic Knights in Russian history. And on the right, Dmitry Donskoy, who in 1380, some of you may know, was involved in the Battle of Kulakova against the Tatars or the Mongols, sort of the beginning and end of Mongol sovereignty or suzerainty over Muscovy. And so these are very important figures, right, in Russian history. And I find it fascinating that these are the images that are being focused on during this period as Stalin is thinking about, empire during this time. All right, so as we move along and trying to be as succinct as possible, because I know we have limited time, eventually the metro changed dramatically in the late 1950s and early 1960s. What I call the grandiose eloquence of the 30s, 40s, and 50s started to end with the rise of Nikita Khrushchev, particularly during his de-Stalinization. Some of you may know that what was part of de-Stalinization was a serious change in architectural norms that critiqued the Stalin era. And in November of 1955, Nikita Khrushchev issued what was a very famous edict. And the edict, and I'm translating into English, was called On the Liquidation of Excesses in Construction and Architecture. That's sort of very de-Stalin thematic, right? But soon after this point, many Moscow metro stations started to be built not only in a more simple or less ornate fashion, but they were intentionally narrow. So a couple things seem to me to be happening here, right? There was a colloquial or folksy term that Russians used during the late Khrushchev era that citizens of Moscow used, even the architects themselves, to describe these new, more practical stations. They used the term caterpillar tunnels. Now, we think of caterpillars, right, in the French, centipedes, 100 legs, 50 pairs, but the Russians use the term sorokonashki, or 40 legs, 20 pairs. And this is the very famous Akademicheskaya, which was built in October 1962. And I always joke about this when I give talks about the metro, because recently I was standing on the platform here with a historian of biology, right, and an architectural historian, and a historian, of biology reminded me that the French are wrong about how many legs centipedes actually have, and the Russians are right, that they're really 40, and that's what we used, right, for our stations, our caterpillar stations during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev era. Okay, but on a serious note, what do I think is happening then, what I like to call everyday socialism architecturally and in the metro? Number one, for those of you who remember that it was during this time period, right, that the micro-regions in Moscow, Leningrad, and other areas were developing. And in the Khrushchev period, there were the 5-story Khrushchev apartment houses that one of my colleagues, Professor Stephen Harris, has written about, in some of his own work. Well, simultaneous with that, you were finding a similar thing in the building of metro stations all over the former Soviet Union during the late Khrushchev era and into the Brezhnev era. So a couple things. Number one, this is what I would call prefabricated architecture now being used in the metro, right? And this is what architects called the pillar-trispin or pillar-trispin design. You generally had literally 40 legs or 40 prefabricated pillars, right? They were usually about the same size of the platform. They were nondescript, much like our great society metro, that it's falling apart at the seams as we speak out in the rain, right? Here, they were not adorned, generally not adorned with art or mosaics, but standardized tiles of standardized colors, usually not marble like the beautiful stations that we saw in earlier periods, right? So this to me is something very interesting. In fact, this type of stations architectural model, especially when the city was expanding dramatically on its outskirts in the 1960s and 70s towards the micro-regions, it seemed to me to become the norm for construction until the post-Soviet era when new, more polished, as I'll show you, thematic models of stations reemerged from the depths, literally, right? And so what you have here is a second thing, it seems, developing, is you have metro stations being built all over the former Soviet Union, but particularly in Moscow, as the Moscow metro expanded dramatically into the regions that are not deep shaft tunneling anymore. And they are very close to the surface, right? They do not have the escalators that the original stations had. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them had stairwells, much like you see in stations, say, in the United States, like in the New York City subway, et cetera. Easier access to some extent, and they were certainly cheaper. And then thirdly, what I do find interesting, I'm trying to do more work on this, is the head architects were a little more diverse, coming from more diverse social backgrounds, training, more technical, what I'm finding, more technical architectural and less artistic backgrounds, maybe less from planning backgrounds, design backgrounds as well. You find also more women as head designers and head architects in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is Yulia Kolesnikova, and if you're interested, she also did Botanicheski Sad in 1978. So she continued to design metro stations into the Brezhnev era and late Brezhnev era as well. So there's an interesting shift, it seems to me, going on during this period that could mimic above ground architecture and planning and financing in the city, as the city was expanding dramatically during this time as well. All right, and to sort of end the last, or what I call the fourth period, if the late 30s, right, or early 40s is one period, the post or the late Stalin era, late 40s, early 50s a second, Khrushchev, Brezhnev a third. Themes, again, did not get reintroduced for the most part, and this is debatable, but they really didn't get introduced with more artistic flavor until, once again, the era of perestroika and glasnost during the Gorbachev era. And some of them reflected certain national themes as well. This is the very famous Mendelevskaya station that was built in 1988. And you could see up here on either side, right, the chemical structures that went along with it in tribute. But what's interesting to me from an architectural standpoint, in the Gorbachev era, you still see, you know, even though the thematics are returning, you still see maybe not the pillar types of architecture, but still standardization as well, and prefabrication has not changed yet. That is until the post-Soviet period. In the post-Soviet period, as I was speaking to one of the audience members before my talk began, you see the emergence, it seems to me, of a number of very eloquent stations that are being built. And I think these eloquent stations are almost mimicking or going back to the period of the 30s again, in the early maybe 40s, where you see beautiful colored marble being used, the sheen, right, and the colors. But you also see, you know, national themes. This is Park Pobєdy, or Park Victory, which glorifies both the Second World War and the war against Napoleon in 1812, I meant to say. And I'm trying to think about sort of the resurgence of these national themes. And it seems to me that there is a development that one could analyze, right, in terms of narrative. And so I want to invoke the cultural critic and semiotician, the specialist Homi Bhabha, who runs the Humanities Center at Harvard, who's argued that nations are revitalizing, when they're revitalizing their national image, and you could argue that's happening today, or over the last 10 years, they tend to invoke narrative themes that are myopic. They tend to glorify a united or unified concept of the nation state, to the exclusion of other types of social, cultural, or even, as he points out in a lot of his narratives, subaltern narratives. That's debatable to some extent, but I think there's a level of that going on in Moscow today, and you see it. This is still Park Pobєdy. It's a beautiful station. It's gorgeous. And you even see it in the new Russian, you know, thematics of the ones that were done in the last 16 years. I'm particularly interested in the one that was done in 2010, Dostoevskого, after the famous 19th century Russian writer Dostoevsky. On the walls here are bas-reliefs of his various novels like The Idiot and Crime and Punishment and others. Whether that means that we're going back in time to a kind of Russian national cultural narrative, I think is debatable, yet I wanted to, you know, leave us with that. So, in due time, and I hope I've been succinct, because obviously we have only about 40 minutes for our lectures, and then I want to open it up for Q&A. If Dr. Pomerantz would allow me, I'd like to just conclude with an epilogue, all right, which I'll read. The Moscow Metro was thus an archetype socialist urban space, especially one with a politicized mission, with its iconographic images going back to the 1930s. The statues, frescoes that we saw today served two functions, both functional transportation for the new individuals in the growing city at various times, but also it had a politicized message. I would call it a kind of meta-meaning, a meta-narrative. As a museum to the 1917 revolution, as a documentation of various generations as it evolved over time to the present. The metro building was a technological feat as well, which I apologize I did not go into today due to time. It was an engineering feat. Deep shaft mining was very dangerous. It had cavernous stations, and it still does, long passenger tunnels. Materials came from literally all over the Soviet Union in the 1930s and 40s, and that continued afterwards. Marble then, and to some extent now, adorns its more ornate stations, and the marble generally comes from the Urals or the Caucasus Mountains. The case study, I think, of the building of the metro can provide historians of science, technology, politics like myself, also a narrative of the building of socialism itself, since the metro was sometimes used in communist rhetoric as a metaphor for the construction of a multi-ethnic, technologically advanced socialist nation. The Bolsheviks would continually say in their rhetoric, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, they would say, "Tavarishi, comrades, we are building a metro, therefore we are building socialism itself." I would like to revise this slogan with my own new narratological version of the old catchphrase, "Tavarishi, comrades, we are building a metro because we still are, and therefore we are telling the story of modern Russia and the state, both socialism and beyond." Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Lots of very interesting ideas and a broad kind of historiography of the period and what the metro meant. I want to ask really kind of a factual question, really. You talked about when the metro is first being built in the 1930s that all the prominent politicians show up, and they have the pictures of Stalin and Lenin on the train and so forth. What happens when they get to the 1950s and they get to very functional stations? Do they send low party officials? Is it really not much of an event, or do they still show up?
Well, first of all, let me answer that in two ways, if I may.
Yeah.
And it's a very good question, actually, because I've been looking at more contemporary 1970s, 80s, 90s journals, right? But let me go back. Actually, even back in the 30s and 40s, as you could see in this slide here, let me just go back if you may, or if I may, hang on one sec. Right here. Even then, you didn't always have high-level dignitaries, right? I mean, Khrushchev was filmed a lot going down in the tunnels, right, but more informally. So usually when they cut the ribbon, and they did this at every station, and they still do, even there, Kaganovich and Khrushchev weren't always there. I mean, they showed them in the metro, but they weren't always there. But an interesting anecdote, Stalin actually visited the metro one evening. And Kaganovich, I found this in an archival note, Kaganovich and Khrushchev came to the Kremlin and brought him down into the metro after it opened in May of 1935 one night, and it was actually functional, right? And they put him on a train, and they ran a couple stations, and then crowds started to notice him, and they literally rushed him out of the metro and into a car and back to the Kremlin. So, Stalin did visit the metro. But over time, less so, to answer your question. And what's interesting is that by the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were so many metro stations being opened in so many former republics. I was just actually in the Library of Congress today, and Harry Like from the Library of Congress is here, and I was talking to him about how stations were being opened up in Armenia, Tbilisi, all over, right? And they were using really prefabricated means and the same kinds of, there was a journal, Metrostroy, but in the 30s and 40s it focused on Moscow. By the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s it focused on cities all over the former Soviet Union. And there you see in the pictures and in the press, and even in, even in the late Soviet period in Moskovskaya Pravda or Vechernaya Moskva, like the evening newspapers, you don't always see dignitaries. I mean, they basically who showed up was, maybe a regional party head. And so there was the fanfare, but not in the way that we think of it, right, in retrospect. So it's an interesting question, actually. I hope that answers it well,
Absolutely.
on a broad level.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
We'll
I'm
go
sorry.
here and then back there and then right here.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I had a question that's kind of engineering or like a project management question, which is I've always been curious about how the metro was built in the late 30s and during the war and an immediate post-war era. It seems like such a huge output of resources and manpower. Like, how was that even possible? And I guess it also relates to, like, why was it so important to keep building the metro during that time period?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think about it in economic terms, right? I mean, let's go back to the period 1902 to 31, where I started, right? There, it's much more difficult in the pre-Soviet imperial period to get the financing, right? And it was very complicated. And remember, Moscow was not the capital, right, until 1918 again, when the Bolsheviks moved the capital back to Moscow during the Civil War. To answer your question, I mean, a command-style economy, you know, can produce that kind of organizational structure, particularly with grandiose, showcase technological projects. I mean, you know, David Holloway has shown this with less showcase projects like the bomb project, right? How an economy can mobilize, particularly a centralized economy, to do that. During the 30s, they brought enormous resources into the city. To answer your question specifically, labor. And interestingly enough, they also had foreign consultants. Actually, the first consultants on the Moscow Metro were British, number one. And the British were there for some time until the Moscow Vickers crisis in the early 30s, and many of them were kicked out. But what's interesting to me is the following, is that the head engineers at the time, even in the 30s, were still advocating the cheaper, close to the ground tunneling, until a younger group of engineers visited London in the 30s, and they saw the Piccadilly Circus metro, and they said, look, maybe if we are going to dig deeper, it's going to be more costly, and it'll require more labor, yet we could use the British technology, we're getting, right, the advisors, and they used actually British railway gauges as well. And they said that if we did that, it would be more costly, but it would be less disruptive going deeper. And indeed, that's what they did. And what was interesting is they were scared to pitch the project. I was reading through the archives to Stalin because they thought that he would go with the cheaper plan. And indeed, he overturned it and went for the more expensive. He thought it was more practical. And so they had a lot of engineering advisors from Britain. Also, German technical advisors were there. The Siemens company, SIEMENS, right, that's still around today, actually helped with some of the original escalators as well, until the late 30s and the purges, when most of the foreign advisors, like in other cities like Magnitogorsk, et cetera, were kicked out. I would answer the question also by just mobilization. I mean, large-scale mobilization for this kind of a project, to the detriment of obviously other projects as well, right? But they had a lot of foreign advisors. You know what's interesting to me, and I hope I'm answering your question in different ways, is that in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a number of British railway engineers visited Moscow, and I read about this in a London newspaper. I think it was maybe The Guardian. And when they went there, they were taken around Moscow by the trust, which now the metro is a type of trust, and it works with the city Duma. But in any case, and they looked at some of the rail tracks, and they said they're still British, you know, from that early period, at least the main ones. But it was an incredibly heroic, endeavor. I mean, from a technological standpoint, they even began with shovels, then they used pneumatic drills, and they kept evolving over time. Water is an issue as well, because for those of you who know Moscow, it's on the confluence of a number of rivers. And so this is something I'm trying to learn more about. I'm fascinated by the complexities of the deep shaft tunneling and certainly the geology of Moscow as well. I hope that answers your question in a nutshell.
You got a microphone. It's right here. And then we'll come to the gentleman next.
My name's Thomas Grindley. The Moscow metro, as you said, tended to lionize the Soviet bureaucrats and the Soviet revolution. Did the fall of communism in 1990 result in their removal from these exalted positions, such as names of stations, etc.?
Yeah, actually, you see, stations changing dramatically, right? From revolutionary names, Prospect Marxa and others. And there was a period, your question's a very good one, there was a period where they were changing a number of them. So remember this station here, named after, one second, Kirov, right? The assassinated Leningrad party chief, who was assassinated in 1934, I believe became Chistaya Prudi, I think is the station. So they went through a kind of chistka in a way, a cleansing process during that time where they removed the sort of revolutionary dynamic names of earlier stations and replaced them, some going back to the original, others removing Bolshevik leaders from the names of stations as well. And then, as that happened, I mean, that's something that I didn't talk about as much, which I'm also interested in. I'm trying to keep a documentation of all the stations that have had their names changed during the period, say 1991 to 99, and then there's a period of sort of invoking national themes after that. That is the creation of new stations as well. But to answer your question from a different angle, I think one preceded the other. That is, the changing of earlier names came first, and there was a conscious effort on that part by the regime during the 1990s. But thanks, I think that's a very important point.
Okay, I see. Let's take these three questions together, and then we'll get Jim group them all together. So 1, 2, and 3. So 1 right here, and then in the back, and then this gentleman here. So we're going to take them all together. So brief questions, please.
I'm curious if the stations were ever used as air raid shelters during the war.
Okay, in the back.
Just going back to the question before that, beyond station names, is there also a lot of communist iconography, art, statues, mosaics, and so on? And did all of that remain intact after 1990, and will it continue to do so? Do we think, or has there been discussion of changing some of that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take this gentleman's question right here in front.
Hello. Hello. My question, or first of all, I want to say, follow up with that earlier question. I think my question came from the exactly opposite side. If I understand it correctly, that question from that lady is about how the early or Stalin period, they mobilize, resources to build this. But as someone came from China originally 30 years ago, I have a completely opposite impression. I listened to your talk and you totally surprised me or educated me on the opposite side. And my this talk, impression was that this was a built up mainly during Stalin time as a showcase, and also it means that he successfully, mobilized all that and just make this magnificent and great, to people. And therefore, afterwards, there's not much, as you call it, evolving, not much of sort of afterwards development. And now I'm totally surprised by what you talked about. It looks like after Stalin time, and this building up or maintaining or evolving continued going on, and we saw all those new renovations or new stations, and still magnificent under the post-Stalin period. So my question became, what's the incentive after Stalin period. What's the incentive to continue that magnificent thing and to that level, which impressed me and puzzled me?
And do you also mean more on the contemporary level too? I mean,
Yeah,
contemporary time.
even today, even
Yeah.
post Soviet Union, whatever. Yeah.
Um,
So post 53, basically, I was surprised that say between 53 and 89, and then after 89 to now,
Okay.
it's totally surprised me.
Can I take these
Yes.
these three questions quickly? And I apologize due
No,
to
not to
time.
worry.
I'll do the best I can. To answer your question regarding, were they used during the war? Well, a couple things. I've been very interested in the metro and the war, and I'm thinking of writing an article about it because I assumed that the only uses of the metro during the war were for the general staff and things like that. So let's take an example. This is the station Kirovskaya again, right, which is now Chistaya Prudi. And what's interesting is during World War II, to answer your question specifically, a branch of the general staff was stationed there. And actually, this is the first station in 1947 which had luminescent lamps as well. And so, and Mayakovsky here, this is where, one second, I apologize. Mayakovsky here was where Stalin on several occasions gave very famous speeches during the war as well, during the Nazi invasion. And thirdly, what's interesting to me is that there were a number of cultural events that were staged during the war, and hospitals were set up as well. I was working in the Khrushchev Architectural Archive in Moscow, as an anecdote quickly, and I was looking through some photographs of film nights that they had during the Nazi invasion, and so an archivist was working with me, and he must have been about, well, this was 2012, so I figure he was about 70 years old, and I was almost exactly right. But the reason why, he had been working with me for a day or two, looking through photographs, and then he taps me on the shoulder, and he says, "Do you know, Professor Andrews, that," he says, "Я тоже родился в Московский метро." And he said, I also was born in the Moscow metro. And then I started to have a long conversation with him and other people about how makeshift hospitals were set up. So the metro was really an active place for, it was a bomb shelter. The general staff was there. Famous speeches were given there, some of them real, others propaganda. There were cultural nights. It's fascinating. As far as your question goes, I see the metro as a contiguous process. It was active at all points. What I try to argue, I hope I will argue in my book, is that even in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, when we think of these bland stations where tiles, were falling off and various things like that, all the same, it was dynamic. They were building more and more. The city was expanding. Khrushchev had as did Brezhnev to some extent, were very interested in developing more mass transit and housing, and they were very active. And now you're seeing what I would describe almost as a kind of renaissance of stations in terms of beauty and art, et cetera. And back there, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember your exact question. Could you just
The
repeat it?
question about communist art and,
Yeah, I mean, here, let's go to these stations here, right? Revolutionary Square, 1938, these famous Promethean busts, they're still there, right? And so what's interesting, to answer your question, is that they went through a period in the Yeltsin era, particularly changing names, right? Like Prospekt Marx, et cetera, and others, but not removing statues and what are called bas-reliefs, in the same way that they did in 1961 when they did remove Stalinist busts as well as bas-reliefs of Stalin and names of stations, to be exact. Okay?
So just a couple last follow-up questions here. I guess the first, going on to this question that was raised I've been through many a metro station under repair. When they repair them, do they
Raymond.
restore them to original socialist glory, or are they trying to update them to more modern times? And my second question is, you talked about the architects who built the early stations. Was that the capstone of their careers as the Stalinization goes forward? Are they somehow tainted for having worked in these stations at the beginning? Obviously, one goes on to design a famous pool, but besides that, I mean, is it perceived as something that as a black mark on their career, or is it something that doesn't really get in the way to their career and professional evolution?
Okay, let me answer the second question, excuse me, first, which I think is very important, and I've been trying to document this. Although it's hard to generalize, I mean, there's hundreds of stations, and there were hundreds of architects and teams. Obviously, one person, like Rembrandt had his team of assistants. It's hard to generalize. However, let's look at some specifics. I guess I would argue no. I do think that once you did certain metro stations, you actually moved on to some prominent positions, quite frankly. Let's take the case of this man, Chechulin, right? He actually was in the Red Army, had training in the Russian State and Technical School, right? And then he designed the Kievsky metro station, and then he went on to become the chief architect of Moscow. So actually, his career went up. All right, how about this man, very famous, Dushkin, who worked with a number of very important artists, right? And he designed some of these very early stations that won international prizes. I mean, these are stunning, right, stations. And his career also went up, if you think about it. He designed 5 subway stations, very famous ones, between 1935 and 1943. He worked with a number of artists. I would almost argue that Dushkin was given more leeway than any of them from an artistic standpoint. He had a lot of artistic license, and that's very interesting. Others, maybe some of them that were, had what I would argue, some of the artists, and that gets back to your question in the back, like Koren, who had the man who did a lot of what seems like early mosaic, early thematics and mosaics. He had, when they traced his background, he had a kind of quote unquote checkered political background. His father was a professional icon painter. And so he, as time went on, although he designed, as I mentioned, a number of stations, his career went up and down. Although, for those of you who remember maybe in the early sort of period of the academic exchange, a number of us were, given academic positions at MGAU, the sort of colossal neo-Gothic Stalin skyscraper building up on the Lenin Hills. And it was Koren, the man who did these mosaics, who was also given the main hall of MGAU to design. So actually, his career went up and down too. So I almost think the opposite, actually. Some of them actually got very prominent positions in the city, and not just in the Stalin era, but beyond as well in the 1960s and 70s. And your first question, again, about Remont. Well, okay, so this has become a complex issue because now the Moscow Metro, although it, on a daily basis, I've seen the statistics, more people ride the Moscow Metro than the London and New York Metro combined. Number one. Number two, Moscow has been considered, I think it's on the list of the 25 megacities globally that the UN has been documenting because they're interested in urban sustainability, as the Woodrow Wilson Center is. And so what comes along with urban sustainability is financing of mass transportation. And I've been interested in the contemporary ramifications of this as well. But so the Metro has been charging more and more, right? As we all know who travel to Moscow, the rates have been going up in order to finance Remont or to finance, the kind of refurbishing of some of the stations. And it's a costly endeavor, particularly for stations such as Komsomolskaya, because you've probably noticed the type of painting that is used as well. The paint, it's a very expensive process. So in some instances, this is going to be a problem, I think, for the city to finance over time, especially as it develops more and more, complex architectural stations like Park Pobєdy, et cetera. I mean, I think what it is it's the maintenance of so many stations, and particularly as it's being linked to mass transit like light rail. And some of you may know they're doing a second ring, Koltsovoye circle line as well, or at least they're projecting and they're starting to work on it too. So it's costly, yet think about it. I mean, what was the impetus or catalyst for this in the 1930s? Population explosion, and this is, I think, the case again to some extent. So it's something that I've been thinking a lot about as well.
Well, thanks so much, Jim. Thanks so much for just a fascinating presentation, and just we look forward to having future updates as you work your way through your book. And thank you so much for your questions, and thank you for coming to the Kennedy Institute.
Thank you so much.